Good morning everyone. For this video, we will see the different perspective of Kachro, Professor Hanki, and Professor Kumar about their discussion on language, dialect, and variety. So now let's begin with Kachro and Nilsson's discussion about language, dialect, and variety. So Kachro is famous for his three concentric circles. For many social linguists, the most important and accurate model is the one proposed by Kachro in 1988, so which is the concentric circles. Later on, we will discuss what it is all about. Let's have first the reality of native versus non-native. So native speakers, as those who have grown up in the inner circle of countries such as the Britain, America, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and non-native speakers whose English is their second language. So what is the argument about these two? So let's say for example, I am an American student and I studied French as my foreign language. So since I am an American student, my native language is English in American. By studying it, I have to master their accent, of course, their grammars, and that's what makes me a non-native speaker of French, since American English is my native language. And now let's move on to the EFL versus ESL. So EFL stands for English as a foreign language, and ESL stands for English as second language. So what is EFL? So EFL users were those who learned English at a distance from any native speakers and for limited utility. So EFL users, for example, the China, the Japan, the Korea, they are using English language as a foreign language because they rarely use it in their daily lives, their daily communication with each other. They just use it when businesses like that. And then the ESL users studied the language more intensely and intimately, and they could speak it, which the EFL person was not necessarily expected to be able to do. So ESL users, Philippines is also included because we uses English in our daily lives. So as a second language, which is very important for us. So there was an implicit association of proficiency level and comparison, which made EFL something less than ESL. So Stevens expressed a more sophisticated view in which he distinguished between primary and secondary language. So as an individual who speak English speaking at home, that is called primary languages. And if the English language is to be learned for purposes of businesses, diplomacy, and education, that is a secondary language. And now let's have the speech community and speech fellowship. So both EFL and ESL countries, together with the countries where English is the primary language, belong to the same speech community. Within the wider speech community, there are speech fellowships that are marked by local contextual features. So, for example, American, British, Australian, and New Zealand are different from each other and are being codified as distinct varieties. But all these speech fellowships are members of the same English-speaking speech community. At this point, I am going to discuss about Catro's three circles. So Catro's three circles consist of the inner circle, the outer circle, and the expanding circle. So the three circles are a conception of the status and functions of English, including their identity conferring capacities that is dynamic and not presumed to be controllable by any agency, group, or native or or otherwise. So the inner circle refers to English as it originally took shape and later was spread across the world in its first diaspora. So for example, the Australia and New Zealand, they are the root of English language. So they belong to the inner circle. And now let's have the outer circle. So the outer circle of Englishes was produced by the second diaspora of English. So which spread the language through colonization in Africa and Asia. So for example, the India, the Singapore, and the Philippines. So we use this language as our second language. The expanding circle represents the further diffusion of English propelled by the political and economic influence of Britain and in the USA, in East Asia, Middle East, and Latin America, Europe, and the island nations of the world. So for example, the China, the Indonesia, and the Thailand. So they uses English as a foreign language, and that's why they belong to the expanding circle, which they use English as very rare for their everyday communication. And now let's talk about range and depth. So range refers to all functions which English has in a given community context. And then depth refers to the users of English that are available to people with varying degrees of education who are at different socio-economic levels with different jobs and profession. According to Cottrell, in defining the nativeness of Englishes, distinctions is useful. So, one refers to the historical relationship and the other to the nativeness of a language in terms of its functional domains. Institutionalized in societies of the outer circle, English is said to be institutionalized. This term refers to the official recognition and acceptance of English. So in the outer circle, who uses English very much, that it that it is already institutionalized, unlike the expanding circle who uses English language as a performance varieties is considered to be not institutionalized. So now let's have the norm providing and norm accepting. So inner circle provides norms and less abstractly teaching models and physical materials such as textbooks. So the one who will accept it is what we call the norm accepting, and it is seen in the expanding circle such as the China, Japan, and the Korea. Although attitudes vary and debates continues, the English language is going through the natural processes of nativization of sounds, grammar, vocabulary, and conventions of using language to perform various acts. So now let's have the nativization and acculturation. So what is nativization? Nativization brings forth to a new variety of English, and Englishization causes change to a native language. Both processes are triggered by language contact and the natural inclination in users to mold the medium to express relevant contextual realities. So nativization affects the structure of English, the sounds, and the use of language, like for example in the writing and speaking. Bilingual's creativity is perhaps the most readily thought of as creative writing, like for example, prose in stories or novels, poetry, or plays for the theater. So countries in the outer circle have already famous for their creativity using the language. So the creativity of using the language is not just all about the fiction. It is also seen in the media or in the newspaper. And now we have the multilingualism and models. So the multilinguals who have English as only one member on their linguistic repertoires have much greater funds of resources for developing and augmenting their Englishes. Monolingual speakers may be baffled by the observation that multilinguals do not use the same language in all domains. This variability is taken as a sign of lack of proficiency in the total range by speakers of any single language of the multilingual repertoire. Let's move on to the two perspectives coming from native and non-native speakers. Let us see if they have the same or different concept looking into language, dialect, and variety. The first one is Professor Georgine Hanke. One of the most difficult theoretical issues in linguistics is to distinguish between language and dialect or language and varieties. He first identified the problem. So the problem cases, the Dutch versus German, the Chinese, and the Jamaican Creole. So first, the Dutch versus German. So the native speakers of German can't understand Dutch. Native speakers of Dutch can understand German very well. The problem there is obviously directions problems of intelligibility. So next is the Chinese. So the Chinese problem told us quite clearly that we must distinguish between phonology and the orthography. For the Jamaican Creole, the problems is with the concept of mutual intelligibility. So for Professor Hanke, in order to distinguish or to define what a language is, we cannot use the criterion of mutual intelligibility as the sole criterion. He said that we need something more. So here are the language criteria. So first is the standardization. Standardization, languages involve a certain degree of standardization, that is the development of a grammar. And the next is the vitality. It, it refers to the existence of a living community of speakers, has distinguishing languages which are alive from languages which are dead. And the next is the autonomy. So autonomy is a matter of feeling and as a rather subjective criterion. So a language must be felt different from other languages. So next is the reduction. So from the word reduction, reduced. Reduce written standards, reduce functions in society, help to distinguish varieties from standard languages. And the next is norms. So norms between good and bad. Where languages normally involve norms, varieties don't. The speakers of languages have the feeling that they are good or bad speakers. So there is a good speakers, ilang represent ang norms as proper usage of language. So like for example sa kanang good sa for example sa good speakers is kanang mga they don't split infinitives. So dialect and variety are the head terms for several types of dialect. And now let's have the dialect and variety. So dialect, which many linguists one can define how languages differ from one another and from their varieties. So the three main types of dialect or variety are regional dialect, social dialect, and phonological dialect. Regional dialect is, for example, in the North America, the degree of post-vocalic is higher, so they would say ka instead of car. So for social dialect, it is when two people speak with one another, their language is always influenced by social factors. So for the phonological dialect, here the accent is changing. So like for example, class and then class. And now let us go to Professor Kumar on his perspective about language, dialect, and variety. So he examined these terms for understanding relationship between language and society. So first, he defined what is language. So language is innate human capacity, a fully structured system, and language defines humans and language used in a society. So the rules of language use are systematic as well. It is both individual as well as social entity. So for him, in order to understand what we mean by rules of language, we need to see the distinction between these two things and rules of language. So there are few terms and ideas that we would like to understand for clearer understanding for the relationship between language and the society. So let's look at the first one, the term grammaticality versus acceptability. So when we say grammaticality, a sentence have to be grammatical. When we say this, we primarily refers to the rules of language that a sentence is possible out of its social context, but it will remain unacceptable. So, for example, the famous example is a colorless green idea sleep fearlessly. So as you have observed, there's nothing wrong with the sentence. It is um, grammatical. It is total grammatical, but it is unacceptable. Why? It is the sentence doesn't mean anything in the real world, and it is out of the social context. When we use the language in the society, we need at least two people. So the two people who are interacting with each other, they are interacting for the purpose of communication. Yes, or interaction. So the term identity is also relevant for understanding of language and society. Identity here doesn't mean that you're a girl or you're a boy, and it is not a preconceived idea. We need to understand these terms because language happens to be one of the strongest marker for construction of identity. Another term which is used several times is speech community. So what is speech community? So speech community, individuals who linguistically behave alike speak the same language, dialect, and variety. It is possible for an individual to belong to many speech communities. So in the context of the understanding of language, there is no distinction between the two terms language and dialect. All natural languages that people speak are acquired in same manner. So languages and varieties, individuals only speak varieties because language include several varieties within. So when we speak different varieties, then what we speak is actually dialect. Therefore, the definition of dialect can only be a language is a dialect.